Hello everybody. In Learning Module 5, we will discuss the processes whereby there is a systematic pattern of inequality based on described social statuses, race, gender, ethnicity. We'll extend these concepts to investigate the reality that these systems of inequality are not merely individual attitudes and behaviors, although these are important, nor are they grounded necessarily in psychology. Okay, we want to move away as sociology, this is a sociology class, from thinking about this as in mere individual terms. What we'll investigate in this unit is the reality that these interrelated patterns of inequality, racism, sexism, ethnocentrism, homophobia, and so forth, are not static individual attitudes or individual behaviors, but are actually social structures. What's a social structure? It's a large-scale, entrenched pattern of behavior that systematically allocates resources, economic resources, political resources, cultural resources, health, medicine, and the justice system resources, including punishment and the law. What the thesis of this chapter is that these resources are allocated in a systematically unequal manner. These systems are fluid. They're not necessarily tied to individual attitudes. Once they're baked in or institutionalized into the social structural arrangements whereby resources are allocated in policies and practices that inherently allocate resources advantageously to one group over the other, there's not necessarily the need for prejudice or individual discrimination. Race is a discredited scientific concept in terms of biology. Yes, there are certainly differences in subpopulations. We can trace their ancestry, all humans, back to Africa, and it is recent, about 50,000 years ago in Eastern Africa. From there, subpopulations of humans migrated to Southern and Western Africa, Europe and the Eurasian landmass, Southeast Asia, to Australia, the Pacific Ocean, and across the land bridge that links Siberia and Alaska. By about 12,000 years ago, humans had settled, to the best of our knowledge, in every part of the world except for Antarctica. They had settled down to Tierra del Fuego in South America and New Zealand off the coast of Australia. Biological markers. So, what is the biology, that we're talking about? Biological markers are incidental evolutionary differences, locally evolved, and their recent adaptations to local environment. We call them markers because they're visible. There are other biological differences between subpopulations of people. For example, people in East Asia, about 80% have type A blood, while Africans and Europeans have type O blood. People who originated in the Eastern Hemisphere of the world are lactose intolerant, where the people of societies in Africa, Europe, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Indian subcontinent can all process dairy products. But none of these are important because we didn't know about any of these until about 100 years ago. Plus, you don't walk around with a big O or an A tattooed to your forehead, telling everybody what your blood type is. When we talk about markers, we're talking about incidental biological characteristics. Hair follicle, shape, levels of melanin in the skin, the presence or absence of eye folds. All are incidental traits that humans developed in subpopulations over the course of the past 50,000 years. Note these 4 pictures in this slide. The first 2 pictures are of African subpopulations that emerged over the millennia within about 100 miles of each other. About the difference from where I'm sitting in Cincinnati, for example, and just south of Lexington, Kentucky, or Indianapolis, Indiana. Not far at all, geographically. But these groups were physically very different due to the fact that even though they were geographically proximate, they lived in very different environments. The first picture of these four in this slide are the Dinka. They are the tallest people in the world. The great Manute Ball, NBA player and great philanthropist who's taken from us too early, was from this group. They are tall, very tall, and dark. The average height, is about 6'4", Okay, the picture second from the right, a subpopulation that grew, evolved or differentiated, a bit biologically over the millennia, they're a group called the Mabuti Pygmy. And they're, on average, the shortest people in the world and comparatively light-skinned. These folks down in the right-hand corner are Mabuti Pygmies with some sort of other group of folks hanging out around them. But it was the only picture I could find. Okay, they're on average the shortest people in the world, and they're light-skinned. The Dinka adapted local biological advantages, tended to intermarry with other people who were similar, to enable them to live on the plains. The Serengeti, the plains, the flat savanna, the grassland, where there's a lot of sun, and they're basically cowboys, essentially, right? Whereas the Mabuti differentiated in a way that was advantageous for them to live in an arboreal or forest environment. Basically, they lived, there's a lot of shade, there's a lot of forest, and these places were geographically proximate to each other. The second two pictures, the second from the left and the far left picture, are people from Scandinavia. The fellow in the blue hat is a Laplander, a group that lives above the Arctic Circle, has eye folds and dark, straight hair. The lady on the right is also a native Scandinavian, from perhaps 200 miles south of the Arctic Circle. The point is that there is not any biological difference inherently, internally, genetically, between these groups, save local evolutionary variability that develops as a result of local physical environment. Then why is the idea of race so pervasive, and how did race and racism develop? The idea of race is pervasive and pernicious. It's steeped both in the emergence of the study of human beings beginning in the 16th through the 19th centuries. The only problem, it coincided with the emergence of the European slave trade. So there was a rejection of anything not European. It was good ideology as inferior, that coincided with the occupation of geographies and the subjugation of local non-white populations on the one hand, and the institution of slavery emerging in the New World on the other. The idea that there's a real distinctive biological difference between groups of people reaches its pseudo-scientific heights in the late 19th century when, for example, they were describing French and German as being different races and measuring and doing measurements of autopsy, intestinal, gastrointestinal differences. It's patently absurd. So this idea of scientific racism, or pseudo-scientific racism, comes to its brutal conclusion, of course, with the defeat of Nazi Germany, which is a place where this was all brought to its dark conclusion. The most extreme version of this thinking, scientific analysis of human groups progresses. The human genome is mapped, and it's found that there are no differences between groups of humans and in terms of biology. Okay, there's no biological, there are no pronounced biological differences. There are incidental differences. Does this mean that there's no race, or the race isn't real? That would be a ridiculous thing to say. Of course not. Race, though, is a social definition. It is what those in power have ascribed in terms of meaning to these biological markers. And it's one that's so pervasive in the society in the United States that it is one of the central organizing tropes, according to Henry Louis Gates, or narratives of American civilization. It is defined by those more powerful in a systematic manner over hundreds of years, in a manner that allows for the unequal distribution of resources, not due to individual attitudes, but due to the way that social institutions, health, the education and justice systems, the political system, are organized. Ethnicity is the identification of a group of peoples as individual and separate and distinct based on cultural indicators or markers. Language, nationality, religion of origin, regional identity. It is another way that resources are unequally distributed based on these also ascribed statuses. All the same mechanisms that apply to race apply to ethnicity. The two are interrelated in some cases. For people who identify as Hispanic, for example, they may be interwoven. One can be Hispanic and of any race. So, institutional racism we have to define versus individual racism. Institutional racism or ethnocentrism is racism or ethnocentrism, as I said before, baked in to the way that institutional spheres, again, these large-scale ways in which resources are allocated and distributed unequally in the society in the United States. Banking policies, redlining real estate values, mortgages, policing and arrest policies, incarceration, enforcement of drug laws and arrest, traffic stops, hyper-segregation in neighborhoods, lack of access to health services, food deserts in urban areas where there are no grocery stores with produce sections, discrimination in health services, historic medical experimentation on groups of people of color, immigration policies, certain aspects of the military, are all examples of large-scale institutional arrangements that, through the way that they operate, discriminate against different minority groups. Note that this is not individual racism, and we need to think, don't throw that away, but we need to think beyond that. This is larger than individual racism, and institutional discrimination functions independently of a person's predilection towards prejudice. We also need to differentiate between prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is an attitude held by individuals, what in psychological terms would be an attitudinal dimension. Discrimination is a behavior, and it can be individual or institutional. It's termed the behavioral dimension. For individuals, of course, there may be prejudice, and there may be, if the individual is in a position to do so, the possibility of discrimination. But to comprehend the scope of institutional discrimination, you have to go beyond merely viewing discrimination as a result of a large number of bad individual actors acting in the same way. This brings us to another topic where we see similar mechanisms: gender versus sex. Sex is a biological difference between males and females. It can be genetic, that can be XX versus XY chromosome, morphological, that's the shape of a male body versus a female body, and hormonal, that is, females tend to have, males and females have combinations of progesterone, estrogen, and testosterone, but in different distributions, of course. If females tend to have estrogen and progesterone, and males have testosterone. But we ascribe meaning to biological sex predicated on the mechanisms associated with gender. the social meaning a society ascribes to biological sex. Now again, there's institutional discrimination based on biological sex because of the way that we put a lot of gendered meanings on the distribution of resources differentially for men and women. The way women were educated, for example, here's another example of this kind of biological essentialism with gender and sex. Yes, there is a biological difference, unlike race. Okay, there's a real obviously, right? There's a biological difference. However, here's where the mechanisms get kind of messed up, and where we have large-scale institutional arrangements that discriminate or allocate resources unequally to men and women. All sorts of meaning is ascribed to biological sex that isn't there. And the kind of gender structures are again, dictated by those in power, that would be men, in a manner that might disadvantage women. Let me give you an example of that, just to get you thinking about it. If I went in 1980, and I was alive and kicking in 1980, I was at my early 30s. No, I was older. I would have been, I'm sorry, I'm aging myself. I would have been about 24 in 1980, 23. There was a Time magazine, it was spread all over the cover. Now Time magazine is electronic only, but at that time there was a biological difference between boys and girls in the way that they learned math. Their brains were organized differently. Girls were verbal and boys were mathematical. Well, the fact is, this was nonsense. It was biological essentialism. And they were ascribing sex differences where there really inherently weren't any. So what happened? Over a generation, they started teaching boys and girls together and focusing equally on the way they were taught mathematics. Boys and girls reached parity in terms of their capacity or ability to do mathematics, right? The difference disappeared. Did women all of a sudden evolve male brains for doing math? Of course not. It was just that people recognized that this is a unequal allocation of educational resources, and to some limited degree, it was addressed. In American society, though, we still have not valued the reality of childbirth and labor and childbirth and so forth, and women are still discriminated against. We still have to all forage for our own child care resources if we're parents or mothers or families with mothers in them. We're the only capitalist advanced democracy that does not provide for child care, as a civil right. And so women struggle again in ways that are still differentiate and allocate resources unequally between women and men. So let's go on and take a look here at the module for the week. So let's have a look at Module 5, Understanding Inequality, Race, Ethnicity, and Gender. We've just talked a bit about it. Okay, here's the module overview. All right, I'm not going to read it, but please read this first. Basically it covers some of the same issues that I covered in the video, but please read this. Okay, let's get back to Module 5 now. And we're going to look at some of the assignments, okay? First of all, we're back to our discussions this week. We had a break in Module 4. So describe a difference between individual and institutional discrimination. I've given you a video It's there in your readings. Please watch the video. I hope, well, if you're watching this video, I don't have to ask you to watch it, okay? Look at institutional discrimination. Don't tell me a guy hit another guy because of, he was prejudiced. That's not it. You're missing the point. Think about it, okay? Think about large-scale patterns of behavior that are in the news, okay? And post and then respond. Please post by Thursday. Today's the 1st. Thursday is gonna be October the 4th, 11:59 p.m. Please post your initial post by Thursday at 11:59 p.m. or earlier, so I can respond. I want to have a chance to do that, and then respond to 2 of your classmates by Sunday. I'll be rooting around, starting Wednesday night, through Friday, responding to everybody's discussion post and seeing if we're lined up and are thinking about this. Okay, so that's our discussion from Module 5. Okay. Then we've got Project Milestone 3. Okay, you've used your concept map, break things down to smaller pieces, and explain some of the connections. It has connections that help you better understand the issue. We've had a couple of really good examples. I'll be putting those up and giving you some examples from the past couple of rounds of assignments of really excellent work that some of your fellow classmates have done. Okay? And that should help you if you're struggling, maybe perhaps their example will help you. Otherwise, please let's stay in touch. Have a great week, and I'll be talking to you within a very short period of time. Take care.